My mother-in-law forced me to choose between my culture and my heart. The thought arrived without fanfare, folded into the steady click of the hotel room thermostat and the small, exacting world Amara had kept for herself. A stack of neatly pressed sheets on the luggage rack, a bar of soap wrapped in its paper, a cotton scarf she wore when she wanted to disappear. She said the line aloud once so that the room could answer back, the sound not for anyone else, but for the way truth tightens in the throat. She had learned early, long before the Whitmore name had entered her life, to live in the seams of other people's days. Her mother taught her how to fold grief into quiet corners, how to make mornings smooth for strangers who had no interest in seeing the hands that ironed their collars. Invisible hands ironed silk. Invisible hands tucked a child's blanket with a tenderness the parents would never notice. It was work that rewarded discretion. It was also survival. But survival had a cost, and on a Tuesday morning, holding a tie that still smelled faintly of expensive tobacco, Amara realized the cost had turned into something else, liability. Victor should have been outside, sweeping the entrance or moving luggage. He should not have been in the private wing, and he certainly should not have been rifling through Charles Whitmore's desk with the deliberateness of a man who knows where everything is kept. For a heartbeat, she watched him as she had watched 1,000 small things, a crease of fabric, a fault in a seam, cataloging, patient. Then his hand closed over metal. The gun was small, practical, wrapped in a towel. He wiped the barrel with the careless civility of a man putting away a tool. Amara did not come from the sort of life where guns meant anything cinematic. In the apartment she shared with Marcus, her younger brother, and the little thrifted clock that kept them honest, a gun meant danger in the street and police lights that made everyone's faces look gray. Here it meant something else, power masked as readiness, a presence meant to intimidate. He saw her because he always saw the furniture of the house, its drawers and hinges, the way others see contours of a face. He shouldn't have seen her, but people like Victor had learned to look where others had been trained to look away. Victor's head turned slowly. He had the bone-setter's confidence of a man whose job was to be practical, not subtle. When he smiled, it was a flash that did nothing to warm the room. "You're early," he said. He used that little Whitmore charm, the one that let servants be invisible while signaling their awareness. Amara kept the tie in her hands. It was a narrow navy stripe with a small, discreet pattern, a tie Charles favored for interviews. The silk caught the light and made thin gores across her palm. She could have left. She could have walked down the hallway, pushed the bell for housekeeping, and let the building accept her invisibility as usual. Instead, she straightened and stepped forward, because names had been given to courage in her life, small ones. This will help. Watch the tray. Kiss his forehead. No one had thought to teach her the names of bigger risks. "Put the towel down," she said, voice neutral, the quiet lower decibels of someone who didn't want to attract attention. Her sentences were measured, as if they were pieces of flatware, precise, useful. Victor's eyes narrowed. He was not the type to be surprised by a housekeeper's nerve. He had been placed in the Whitmore lane for a reason, proximity. "You should be elsewhere," he said, and his tone purported to be a rebuke. Instead, it felt like an invitation to the kind of choice Amara had been avoiding her whole life. She did what her ancestors had taught her through the years of silence, saw the human hiding behind the satin, called the truth gently. "There is a weapon in your employer's room," she said. "You don't belong here right now." That half-command, half-admission did a lot of work. It unmoored Victor the way a brisk wind unmakes a paper hat. He recovered fast. His face went from amused to careful. "He's out," he said. "No one will—" "He will come back,"
she cut in, and he should know. She felt something shift then, a pivot of air around them, the building's hush tightening into a string about to snap. Victor's hand tightened on the towel, as if wringing out an idea. "Tell him," he said, a challenge wrapped in ordinary menace. Amara considered the tally of reasons to stay invisible. There were many. There were also faces. There was Eli, thin and solemn in his school photos, an 8-year-old who treated Amara like a safe patch of light. There was Charles, who once let the seam on his cuff hang loose and then smiled a private smile when Amara corrected it and said nothing. There was Marcus, who still called after every shift, asking with lopsided optimism if Amara had enough to eat. She thought of all of them and chose a different hospitality that morning. She chose honesty. She found Charles in the winter garden, a place where the plants were real and sunlight seemed to have been bought and installed by an investor. He was talking to a man with a perfect suit in an invisible ring of authority. The man was the sort of professional who kept his hands still and let the rest of the room do the work of telling you who he was. Charles listened with the slow appraisal of someone who, over the years, had learned to let other people's noise demonstrate itself. He noticed Amara because she was not a noise. She was a small instrument, finely tuned. "Charles," she said. The name came out clean. He looked up. The expression that crossed his face was a thing Amara had not expected to see. Not patronage, not curiosity, but a blade of relief, the kind you afford a person who has come to you from a trouble you did not know you had. "Amara, what's wrong?" She described Victor.
She used the verb that felt safest. I saw. That was the ledger of her truth. Observations written down so that someone with a ledger of power could do something with them. Charles's face changed in the way a sky changes before an unexpected storm. He completed a sentence that had not been started aloud. "He wasn't supposed to," he began, and then he stopped because the world required the presence of evidence. He looked at her as if suddenly those invisible hands had been given sight. He spoke with a quickness she was not used to from him. "Stay with me. Close the garden doors." By the time the security team arrived, Amara had been offered a cup of coffee she didn't intend to drink and a place at a table that felt like the center of a map. Margaret arrived first, quiet, with a laptop bag thrown like a prayer over her shoulder. Daniel came with the leathery competence of someone who had seen too many things that could have been prevented. Victor, when questioned, had a neat story that didn't add up. There are always neat stories in powerful houses. Charles looked at her in a way that made her skin feel both larger and more fragile. He folded his hands around his coffee, the porcelain small and hot. "Thank you," he said, and she saw the kind of gratitude that levitates and carries a debt in its wake. An hour later, she found herself in a meeting room in Manhattan, the kind of room she'd seen once on television when Marcus and their neighbor argued about a city budget. It smelled of citrus cleaner and expenses. There were charts on the wall. Men and women in quiet suits measured off their words like architects. Amara was out of her usual element, out of the linen cart's orbit and into the glare of glass that looked down onto the avenue. It was dizzying. There were windows that made the city look paper-thin and a round table that caught glints of sunlight like accusation. Charles introduced her to a small set of his inner circle with an easy professionalism. "This is Amara Kite. She alerted me this morning and saved us some complications." He said it without theatrics. The words were pragmatic, but they carried meaning. The room turned to her like a beam directed at the thing it had been told to illuminate. Margaret examined her quietly. Daniel gave the faint nod of someone cataloging assets. Someone in the room, an outsider Amara had never seen before, sat very still with a recorder half-shadowed under his sleeve. The device looked like a small black beetle, discreet, enduring. Amara felt the air change. The meeting resumed. Names were thrown around, protocol, integrity, chain of custody, words that meant how to preserve a reputation and keep others from pulling its threads. She listened, not as one learning a language, but as someone who had always been fluent in the gestures of carefulness. She noticed. She stored. She saw a hand brush a sleeve and found herself automatically cataloging the cadence of movement as if it were a fingerprint.
When the meeting broke, someone clapped Daniel on the shoulder and said, almost as if it were a pleasantry, "Someone's been very busy." The room laughed, a small sound like loose change. Amara felt a flush of something she couldn't name, part vindication, part the vertigo of a newly opened door. Outside the room, in a narrow corridor, a woman waited. She was older than Margaret, but exuded the same kind of contained energy, tidy shoes, a voice that made no sound but suggested careful deliberation. Her hair was silvered in a manner that franked authority and care. She wore a scarf that folded like a flag. When she smiled, it looked like the sort of smile that keeps ballots in order. "Amara," she said, as if the name itself were a summons, "your work today was unexpectedly useful." She had a voice that could be read in several dialects of influence. "I am Dahlia Whitmore." Amara's palms found the seam of her coat. Dahlia's handshake was brief and perfunctory, the sort that measured a person and filed them under expectation. There was no bitterness in her eyes, but there was a history, a way the skin around the eyes had learned to believe certain things about how the world ought to behave. "You did right," Dahlia told her. "It wasn't gratitude as much as it was categorization. There are ways we keep this house safe, things that must not leak." "Were you," Amara began, startled, until she realized what Dahlia meant. "You mean the family?" Dahlia cut across her gently. "Culture isn't merely about children learning to fold napkins," she said. "It is a kind of grammar for how we survive each other. There are parts of our life we do not speak of in public, for the good of your employer, of his son." "And for the good of the Whitmore name," Amara finished, almost before she realized she had spoken. The phrase felt bitter and metallic on her tongue. Dahlia inclined her head, the kind of movement that could be read as approval. "Exactly." She paused, then added in a smaller tone, "When things like this happen, they ripple. People notice. People take your silence for weakness or complicity. We cannot have that." Amara felt the room tilt. She had moved from the periphery to the hearth, but the hearth had its own trustees. Dahlia's words were not a welcome, they were a fence post. They drew a clear line in the soft sand of Amara's life. Amara understood that what Dahlia meant by culture was not merely tradition, it was protection of an image. It was the idea that to preserve an institution, you might have to sacrifice the truth. Dahlia's eyes softened, curiously maternal. "You are part of this household now, whether you like it or not. That brings responsibilities." The implication hung between them like a crystal. Do your duty, keep the house's secrets, and in return the family will provide a kind of shelter.
Amara wanted to tell Dahlia about Marcus and their small flat 2 boroughs away, about the recipe for the lentils her mother made when grief occupied the room, about the hollow they called home when rent was due. But she didn't. Dahlia had not asked, she had only offered an expectation. When Charles suggested a forensic sweep, Margaret's jaw tightened in professional alertness. "We need to know if this was selective theft or part of something larger," she said. "If there's a weapon, there may be surveillance. There may be feeds. We cannot assume the house is not on camera." "Feeds?" Amara echoed, the word resonating like a distant bell. She had always expected that the house was watched in the ways one watches a patient, medically and occasionally. But to be the subject of a feed, someone's daily life looping in a server room in a place she'd never set foot in, that was a different violation. Margaret's fingers hovered over her laptop. "We run a sweep. We check hard drives in the staff quarters, lockers, vehicles. Someone could have left a device. Cameras can be disguised as anything." She looked at Amara with a kind of focused clarity that both frightened and comforted her. "We may find footage." Amara walked back to the service elevator with Daniel, and their radios crackled like insects in their ears. The lift smelled of solvent and contained both the luxury of the apartments and the ordinariness of the service staff. In the lift mirror, she watched herself as other people did, her hair pinned back in a practical knot, the line of her jaw set like a coin. She felt newly observed by strangers on the street who suddenly saw her as a person who had done something big enough to move a room. In the days that followed, the house changed its rhythms. Staff rotations were shuffled, pockets searched, procedural questions asked. Victor kept his distance like an animal wounded. Amara watched him with the impatience of someone who could not tell whether the man was dangerous because of what he knew or because of whom he answered to. At night, when the Whitmore staff left with their paychecks and needities, Amara would walk the route back to the subway and feel the city's skin press against her, the way a crowd presses fabric against bone. She carried the sense of responsibility like an extra coat. Early on, she received a message from Marcus, one she read in the fluorescent light of the train station. He had gotten a temp gig moving boxes for a store near their place. He wanted to know if she had eaten. He used the small icons that had replaced the way people used to ask one another questions out loud. She thumbed a reply, "I'm fine," and also, "Be careful." It was both humility and a transmission of worry. Marcus had always been her moral barometer, short with jokes, long with tenderness. She wondered how to explain what had shifted. At a quieter hour, Charles invited her to the Whitmore Estates kitchen for tea.
They sat across from each other at a table rescued from silence. Eli's coloring pages were pinned to the refrigerator with magnets that spelled out the names of holidays she had never celebrated with that family. Eli himself was there, with a construction paper folder and a look that made Amara feel like someone deserving of his trust, not simply hired hands. He slid a paper under the table that said in clumsily formed letters, "Thank you for fixing my tie." Amara folded the note and kept it in her pocket like a word that changes a life. "Why did you come?" Charles asked at one point, not accusatory but curious in that particular way men are when they are trying to measure how someone else's ethics stack up against their own. "Why warn me? You could have—" "I have family," Amara said at once. "My brother. People depend on me to be here, or else—" The sentence trailed off. She could have said that it was loyalty. She could have said it was habit. Instead, she said, "Because I couldn't see him in danger and do nothing." Charles watched her. He seemed to measure the world imaginatively, weighing possibilities, balancing risks with the currency of his responsibilities. "We need people who will stand where it matters," he said. "We need you." It was not an offer so much as a proposition. Stay near. Look for what others don't. Be the kind of witness that justice often lacks. To Amara, it felt like a rebirth and an imposition at once. She left that afternoon with a role described in halting corporate language, occasional access to sensitive areas, a promise of confidentiality, a reminder that the house had protocols and that there would be consequences for breaking them. Behind the euphemisms, she heard the heavy syllables of a jobless ladder, visibility as liability, but also as a doorway. That night, alone in her small flat, she unfolded the scarf Dahlia had given her, soft, unassuming, the kind of present that was a social adhesive. Tucked into its fold was a small card. "For discretion," Dahlia had written. There was nothing malicious about the note. It read like a parental reminder. But the card lodged in Amara's mind like a splinter of truth. Culture had become a claim on silence, and the man who had once been a stranger to her was enlisting her in a family history that required a kind of erasure. "Sometimes culture keeps people safe," Marcus would say when they argued, and there was a way he said it with his mouth tight and his hands balled in his lap. Sometimes culture kept predators in power. The two ideas nest together in people's mouths until it becomes impossible to separate the kindness from the imperative to obey.
Amara felt both possibilities press in on her like a tide. She began to notice, with the sort of detailed attention that had always been her strength, threads that didn't belong to the Whitmore pattern. A cable tucked behind a painting in the study. The faint buzz of a device under a banquet room table.
Patterns in the inventory lists that suggested small items, tuned microphones, disguised power supplies, moving back and forth with an ordinariness that had the shape of a conspiracy. She wrote each discovery down on the back of a receipt and folded the scraps into the pocket of her coat. If her life had taught her anything, it was that evidence is an accumulation of small truths. Each small truth can be dismissed, but together they become a shape you can hold. The first explicit pressure came at a dinner that felt less like an invitation and more like an evaluation. Dahlia had asked Amara to join them, citing family inclusion, a phrase that made Amara feel like a display piece. Around the table there were conversations about art funds and school boards, the gentle grind of people who were both bored and dangerous in their boredom. Dahlia, however, fixed her attention on Amara as if testing the tenor of the girl in front of her. "You are now part of the house," Dahlia said. "You have seen things. That gives you opportunities and responsibilities." She spoke as if offering a balanced ledger. "There are expectations. The public eye is not our friend. What we protect is the family and the family's culture." Amara could hear the unstated rule in Dahlia's voice: preserve the household even if it means containing the truth. It was the kind of cultural injunction that gets dressed in polite clothing and parades as moral instruction. When Amara asked a direct question, what does protecting the family mean if someone inside the house is using its people for profit? The table quieted. The fork in front of Dahlia's hand made a little metallic sound. Dahlia's reply came soft as velvet and hard as a lock. There are ways to keep families intact. Not everything serves a headline. She tilted her head in a gentle courtliness that stung. You must understand that sometimes preserving a family's dignity means silence. There are lines that once crossed cannot be fixed. It was then that Amara understood with the clarity of a struck match what Dahlia had meant when she said culture was a grammar for survival. What Dahlia wanted protected was not the people who made the house run, but the image of them. There was a moral architecture here that required someone to close ranks and not speak. The family would survive. The workers would remain invisible. The truth would be a casualty. Amara's chest tightened. In the kitchen, as plates were cleared, she saw Victor standing by the stove, a shadow among pans. He glanced toward her and then away, as if searching for permission to act. Somewhere in the house, a camera blinked like a slow heartbeat. She thought of Eli, who trusted her with crayons and secrets. She thought of Marcus, waiting for her at home. She thought of Charles, whose gratitude had lodged in his face like a small, persistent ache. She had been offered a role that moved her from background to instrument. The offer came with stakes: keep quiet and protect, or speak and risk fracture. The choices did not line up neatly with the life she had imagined. That night, sleep was a skittish thing. She lay awake and counted the things that had been asked of her before: loyalty, silence, neatness, and how this request, to become invisible even in the face of wrongdoing, felt like a theft. To refrain from telling the truth for the sake of image felt like participating in the erasure of the people who made that image possible. There was a single sharp moment where her heart clarified the choice for her, a flash in the dark of her room. In the morning, on her way to Marcus's apartment to check in, she found a photograph slipped beneath her door. It was a grainy picture of Marcus unloading boxes. Someone had made a note on the back with a bluntness that made the blood run cold. "We see where he goes. Do not interfere." The neighbor's cat blanched in the doorway, and Amara's hand shook as she counted the teeth of the envelope.
The message was old, thinly veiled threat, but its implication was real. Whoever had arms inside the Whitmore orbit apparently knew where her brother worked. The house she had entered to protect was sending tendrils into her life. For the first time, the matter of cultural obligation became not an abstract conversation with Dahlia, but a personal test of conscience. If she obeyed Dahlia, if she folded the truth into the house's neat protocols, she might keep Marcus safe. If she followed the inclinations of her heart to expose the truth she was seeing, to bring the surveillance into light, she might put her brother in peril. That was the moment the scales truly tipped. It is easy to speak of moral choices abstractly. It is harder when the choice is a map that leads directly toward the people you love. Amara sat at the small lion's claw table in her kitchen and pressed the photo to her chest. Her heart was not a compass that responded to instructions. It pointed in a direction she already knew. She had been taught to be invisible, but invisibility, she was learning, is itself a form of powerlessness. She could keep quiet and be secure in the way that privilege often defines security, or she could shout and risk dismantling a house so rigid that it had become a cage. She folded the photograph and put it in her pocket. There was one other thing she could do: find whoever had put the gun in Charles's room and trace the thread backwards. If there were feeds, if there were servers tucked away in some stone farm, she would find them. If Vanessa or Gerald, names that floated in Catherine's throwaway gossip, were pawns, she would learn their strings. Margaret and Daniel had promised a sweep, but the house's perimeters were long, and the city's power is often ghost-like. Amara had come this far by noticing the furtive glint of a cable, the cadence of a footstep, the tell of a hand wiping a barrel.
She would use that observation now as if it were a weapon that could be used for protection rather than intimidation. As she left for the night to walk the city that felt both smaller and more crystal to her, she caught her reflection in a shop window. The glass returned an image, a woman standing between two worlds, scarf tied with Dahlia's careful hand, jacket wrinkled from a long day. Behind her, the city's lights were a smear. In the reflection, the windows of the Whitmore Tower were bright like the eyes of a bird of prey. She whispered into the night, not quite to herself and not fully to the city, "I will not be invisible anymore." Some doors had already been opened that could not be shut. The question now was what she would find when she followed the lines that other people had laid in the dark. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of noise, drop your city below. The sentence left her like a small ritual, private and needed. She spoke it into the cold air as she stepped away from the Whitmore reflection and into the city's smear of light, as if naming the problem could make it more concrete. Then she folded it away and started to follow the thread that had begun to loosen under her fingers. The first real break came from a mediating detail, an invoice buried in a vendor packet that Margaret turned up after 2 nights of refusing sleep. The line item was a delivery to a storage facility 4 hours north of the city, listed under a shell company whose name was a suggestion of florals and absence. For most of the staff, it might have read as another tedious footnote. To Margaret, it read like the direction of a hidden door. She tagged the file and slid it across to Amara in the morning, their hands touching over the laptop like a brief passing of permission. "This is where I think the feeds could be housed," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, as if saying it aloud could keep panic contained. "We need to verify physical access. If someone has been recording in private spaces and routing those recordings out, it'll be here or somewhere like it." Amara's throat constricted in a way she had come to recognize when the world tilted just enough for the seams to show. "I will go," she said before she had allowed herself to weigh the possible consequences. Saying yes felt like removing a soft bandage. Saying no would be to accept the life Dahlia expected of her. They planned a small reconnaissance. Daniel arranged for 2 security vans to drive out under the guise of a supply run for estate renovations.
Margaret would meet them with a sealed subpoena she had cultivated through an old contact at legal. Amara was not supposed to be there, but Daniel's insistence had an edge that made it clear he wanted her at his side. "You saw him," he said simply. "You know how they move." The drive to the facility was long enough for Amara to measure the distance between one world and another.
The city fell away into lawns, and then into a kind of undemanding quiet that smelled of hay and rain on stone. The facility itself looked like a converted dairy barn, long, low, with vents that hummed in the night. Cameras dotted the eaves. A guard sat in a small booth with a lantern. There was a faint acoustic, like a phone vibrating on wood. They had their procedural uniforms and plausible explanations. Margaret presented the paperwork with the kind of clinical calm that passes for authority. The guard waved them through because the sheets of paper had signatures, and because people who carry signatures on a rainy Tuesday night are rarely questioned too far into the night. The air that hit Amara when the security doors closed was cooler and smelled of server dust, clean, metallic, and infinitely small. Inside, the rooms were laid out like the guts of an animal, racks and racks of machines, each with blinking lights like a constellation rearranged into corporate efficiency. The hum of the servers was a low chorus that seemed to read the room. Wires ran like veins. On one wall, monitors were arranged like windows, frozen on frames of kitchen tables, bedrooms, the foot of a child's bed. The feeds weren't theatrical, they were quotidian, and therefore cruel. A camera had been mounted so that you could watch Eli tracing patterns on paper. Another feed showed the study where Charles had once kept his ledger, the angle too good not to be intentional. Amara's hands found the seam of her coat, as if stabilizing herself. She had imagined cameras in the abstract, but not the intimacy of the shots, how a camera chooses where to rest like an uninvited guest, and how it learns to be more interested in the ordinary than the extraordinary. The sensation was not of violation alone, but of one's life being repurposed into someone else's commodity. Margaret set to work. Her fingers moved with an economy of purpose. Pull this drive, isolate this IP, mirror that server. Daniel shadowed the racks with the concentration of a man who had built his identity around preventing surprises. They worked quietly, the way people do when the stakes are measured not in money alone, but in the privacy and dignity of people whose names didn't make headlines. They found the log entries quickly enough, times and dates, the originating node within Whitmore Holdings, and a transfer schedule that suggested more than one destination. There were file labels, innocuous names like housekeeping_updates, that in a moment of corporate laziness gave everything away. Someone had engineered a route from the estate's internal feeds to a server farm that then distributed those feeds to anonymous mailboxes. It was precise, clean, and cold. Whoever is behind this wanted to be able to bring things up on demand, either for leverage or as part of a larger blackmail operation, or worse. Amara thought of the towel around the gun. She thought of the photograph slipped under her door.
The feeds had not been accidental voyeurism. They had been a way of making people legible in a ledger that benefited the unseen. They mirrored the data onto encrypted drives and copied the hashes into a ledger that could be presented in legal contexts. They left the facility with enough evidence to start a serious inquiry. The night air felt sharp against Amara's face as they drove back. She watched the world through the window and felt it clicking into the comprehension of others. There are people who look. There are people who keep watching, even when the watched think they're safe. But the discovery did not sit in the world like a closed case. News has an economy of its own. The more you shine light, the more shadows rearrange. Within 48 hours, the household began to crack in small ways. Someone drained the power from the staff room for a long stretch. A delivered package to Marcus was rerouted. An anonymous number began to call Amara's phone and then hang up. A tie was left on her doorstep one morning, navy silk, a pattern she knew only too well. The presence of a tie at the foot of her building felt like a letter passed under a door that said, "We can reach you." Dahlia's influence did not remain passive. Her pressure arrived in forms that were at once tender and strategic.
She invited Amara for an informal afternoon conversation in a drawing room where the furniture seemed to have been arranged to contain secrets. The light fell through lace and dust like an indictment. "You're making choices beyond your role," Dahlia said, not unkindly. "I have always said we must temper courage with prudence." Amara set her cup down with care. "I thought prudence was about preventing harm," she replied, "keeping the house safe." "And it is," Dahlia said, "but you must understand the consequence of turning a family inside out. There are reputations, alliances, and people who depend on that structure. When you expose what is inside, you sometimes destroy more than you fix." Her voice was threaded with the kind of authority that has weathered many storms. It was not a rant, it was a measured appeal to the kinds of values that people keep in their libraries: legacy, discretion, continuity. The words landed heavy because they were not devoid of truth. A family is, in many ways, an institution. To bring its ills to light can harm people who are not guilty of those ills. Dahlia's eyes were kind the way pain can be kind. She continued, "There are other ways. There are channels. We could manage this internally. Quiet the feeds. Dismiss the men who took those jobs. Keep the children out of the press. You'd be doing both your part and ours." Amara's hands tightened around the cup, the porcelain leaving a circle of warmth. She thought of the feeds, of the server racks with their blinking lights, of Eli asleep on a feed somewhere in the barn of servers. She thought of Marcus and the photograph.
She had been told in 1,000 small ways that silence was practical and sometimes noble. But Dahlia's version of culture felt like a lid, secure but smothering. "I can't do that," Amara said simply. Her voice did not waver because she had practiced saying it aloud in the nights before. "If I agree to keep this inside, then people will remain at risk. The feeds show more than things you'd rather not make public. They're a pattern of how people are treated. I am not asking you to stay silent for the sake of corruption," Dahlia said, leaning forward. "I'm asking you to consider the children, the staff, the people who depend on stability. Filing a public case may be the right thing in an abstract sense, but it will pull the family into a very specific kind of fire that will burn certain people unnecessarily." "You mean people like cleaners, like those whose laundry I fold." Amara's words were quieter than she had meant. They landed like a small stone. Dahlia's expression didn't change much. There was a shadow of regret that flickered, then steadied. "Not just them. The Whitmore Foundation does a lot of good. There are scholarships, hospitals that have benefited. You must know the scale of what holds this family accountable to the public good." "There are better ways to do good than to silence victims," Amara replied. The sentence felt both childish and ironclad in her mouth. The meeting ended with Dahlia's hand on hers, an almost motherly gesture that had the undertow of command. "Think on it," Dahlia said. "We will be watching you, Amara. Not to threaten, though if you choose to act without counsel, that will be on your conscience, but to support you if you choose the family's way." When Amara left the house that day, the choice felt the size of a tidal shift. Dahlia had not demanded that she keep silent in words that could be out in the open. She had asked for consideration, for prudence, for an accounting of the harm that exposure would cause. It was a pressure dressed as a kindness, and kindness with the teeth of command is harder to refuse. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place through a mistake rather than a stroke of genius. Vanessa Sloane had come to town with the kind of face corporations invent when they want a presence that is both attention-getting and unthreatening. She had made a show of working in a nondescript office 2 blocks from Whitmore Tower, but her files were a labyrinth. Marginal notes suggested that she visited the storage facility occasionally to check on maintenance, and that she had access keys logged under a third-party name. Amara and Margaret decided to follow the trail. The plan was cautious: watch Vanessa's movements, corroborate expenses, find a pattern.
For weeks, Vanessa's life read like an advertisement in small increments: lunches, elevator rides, a propensity for pale lipstick. But dossiers have seams. On a rain-heavy morning, Amara watched Vanessa exit a cab at a cafe and through a sliver of a window saw her slip a small leather-bound item into a coat pocket. A habit Amara had learned: watch the sleeves, paid off. Vanessa's movements were deliberately choreographed, but the tell was there: a quick rub of the fingers against the seam of her jacket, an unconscious gesture that meant she was hiding something. They trailed her to a private club where she met a man who introduced himself as a consultant. Through careful listening and a series of legal maneuvers Margaret had quietly prepared, they managed to place Vanessa under a gentle but persuasive pressure, an invitation to a meeting that felt routine and harmless. Daniel's presence at the periphery made the club feel less airy and more like a net. When asked about the leather-bound item, Vanessa initially smiled and deflected. "Do you know how vulnerable people are to their own small habits?" Margaret said later, when they had Vanessa in a holding room and a legal stipulation on the table. "You can't hide a feed in plain sight forever." Vanessa's defiance was the kind that comes from being paid to pretend. For a minute she clung to an easy bravado, then the velvet of leverage tightened and she found herself answering differently. The leather-bound object contained a USB drive tucked into a hollowed binding. On it were files, logs, transfer protocols, names, lists that corroded the illusion of randomness. There were emails that referenced an optimization of human capital and attachments that detailed revenue projections tied to exclusive access to private feeds. When Margaret forced Vanessa to reveal the chain, the name that emerged like a shadow at noontime was that of Elias Kane, financier, benefactor to charities, and a man whose public face had the polish of philanthropy. The files on the drive suggested a more insidious architecture. Kane's operation had been monetizing privacy, packaging intimate human moments into data streams that could be sold to interested parties, investors, corporate rivals, and shadow firms, turning the daily lives of the house into commodities for manipulation and leverage. Vanessa insisted she was a lawyer. Her protests sounded like someone who had practiced rhetoric as a career. But the records told another story. She had been a pawn, a specialist in compliance loopholes, hired to create buffers and plausible deniability. Her hands shook as she signed a cooperation agreement that morning. She named names, trimmed at the edges of her involvement, but she also gave them a map into the network that connected the server farm, the shell companies, and a host of satellite accounts that made Kane's operations feel immovable. Once Vanessa's name was on the table, the response from the other side sharpened.
Amara began to receive envelopes stuffed with single sheets of paper that contained observations about Marcus's route to work, his colleagues' faces circled in crude ink. The threats were not new, they were more brazen now, as if whoever was orchestrating this wanted Amara to know they had reach, that they could touch the small people in her life, and do it with the coolness of a man signing a check. They escalated by sending a small bouquet to Eli's school with a note that said nothing but made the teacher's face tense. The gestures were calibrated to produce fear without an overt act. They were signals that said, "We can touch the perimeter." They had no interest in a scandal that would blow up into open confrontation if a quieter method could keep things in tune. Charles reacted with a fury that had been rare to see. He demanded that the legal team move faster, that Margaret compile a public case that could be launched in tandem with a private sting. The idea was to create a two-front strategy, gather incontrovertible evidence to hand to authorities while simultaneously preparing to pull the net in such a way that Kane could not see it coming. The sting required a performance that was almost theatrical in its simplicity. They would stage a false acquisition of a rival biotech firm, something Kane had been attempting for years, creating a meeting that would lure him into revealing himself. Vanessa agreed to play her part with reluctant precision.
Daniel and Margaret created a plausible contract. Amara rehearsed the small gestures she would use to plant a key piece of evidence in Kane's orbit. It was the kind of plan that looked like a chessboard. Every move counted, and a single misstep would scatter the pieces. Marcus's role in the story shifted from peripheral anxiety to a potential bait. They were careful with him, moving him into a temp job that kept him away from the obvious paths the Watchers monitored. He protested at first. He was stubborn in ways Amara loved, but when she explained with the clarity of someone who had learned to measure danger, he yielded. The photograph under her door had changed everything. It had made the risks personal rather than theoretical. In the weeks leading up to the sting, Amara's life contracted and expanded in odd rhythms. She practiced being someone who could work a meeting with the quiet authority of a person who had a stake in what's true. She learned how to place a USB in a briefcase so that it looked ordinary. She learned the cadence of the people in Kane's world, the small beats that signaled truth, how a hand lingered on a tie when someone felt threatened, how the light in the lobby communicated the level of security someone felt. There were small victories along the way. They secured an internal email from Ron Mitchell, a mid-level executive with a taste for gambling on insiders, that detailed late-night transfers to a Cayman account with an annotation that read, "Privacy Product Test."
A meeting transcript between Gerald Clean and a shell company representative hinted at an extortion scheme involving recorded conversations from family dinners. Each piece was incremental, but the law is patient and likes its puzzle pieces tidy. Then came the night of the gala, a charitable event thrown by the Whitmore Foundation with the precise intention of doing some good and doing even more PR. The ballroom glittered with dresses and lapels. Servers moved like tides of white cloth. Dahlia presided with a graciousness that could have been custom-made. She wore a gown that read as authority, the fabric holding its own like a shield. There was an orchestra playing an arrangement that made people sink into their good intentions. The plan was to use the gala as cover. Kane had a pattern. He liked to publicize philanthropy in cities where he also worked deals in the shadows. They had reason to believe he would attend an event on a night his calendar suggested travel, an opening for them to plant the bait. Amara played a role that required her to be both invisible and conspicuous in calibrated measures. She walked the room with a tray of champagne flutes, a practiced smile in place, while Margaret and Daniel operated behind the stage. Vanessa circulated the room, now a cooperating actor, with a small recorder slipped into the lining of her clutch. Kane arrived like a man used to being the star of a small, exclusive universe. He wore a tie that was a quiet kind of arrogance, dark, well-knotted, the kind of accessory that announces self-possession. The bait worked because Kane's ego made him predictable. He took the bait like a fisherman, tossing a lure and watching the glitter of water near his boat. At a corner table, under the guise of an introduction, a man approached Kane and mentioned a confidential digitized portfolio of enhanced visibility, the language of Kane's product. Kane leaned forward with an interest that read as hunger. Margaret played backup with the precision of someone who could hear a pin drop even in a ballroom. Daniel was positioned to intercept. Vanessa produced the exchange that linked Kane to the server routes in a manner that was almost elegant in its clarity. The moment of catching him, however, was not cinematic in the way one sees in films. There was no sudden handcuffing in front of gasping crowds. Instead, there was a series of small mechanical events, a recorded acknowledgement of payment on a secure line, a confirmation from a satellite VPN, a whisper of code that Margaret recognized. Then the room shifted because the team outside executed a maneuver. Law enforcement was quietly notified under a warrant Margaret had obtained with clinical timing, and Kane stepped out to take a call he thought was private. The arrest at the hangar 2 nights later was violent in its understatement.
Kane arrived for a supposed private flight, He loved to stave off publicity with a veneer of business, and found themselves surrounded by men who did not ask for his consent to be taken. There were plain SUVs and people with badges. His face was the face of a man who believed the world owed him the benefit of very specific doubts. He protested. His voice had the tone of a man unfamiliar with the feeling of being stripped of influence. He was hustled into a vehicle, the scene staged so that the press could not render it as a circus, but as an inevitable closing of a window in which he had once operated comfortably. Kane's arrest made the news in the kind of way that cracks reputations like glass. Headlines talked about privacy violations and commodification of the domestic. Columnists wrote op-eds about the ethics of surveillance in an age where technology had matured without a parallel ethical framework. The Whitmore name became bound to both scandal and conscience, depending on which line of the story you read. Public exposure did not solve everything. Kane's lawyers moved fast, assembling teams that argued procedural missteps, questioning the chain of custody of the mirrored drives. Vanessa's cooperation invited skepticism. For a while, it seemed as if the legal machinery would stall on the minimum of technicalities, arguments about the legality of remote data retrieval, the fine print of wiretapping statutes. The next weeks became a war of attrition fought in depositions and forensic marketplaces. Margaret and the Whitmore legal team had to anticipate arguments and shore up their case at every crevice. But there were human moments that most headlines missed. Margaret sat in a deposition wearing a suit that read like quiet defiance, and Amara watched her stand like a person who felt the gravity of their collective responsibility. Daniel argued with a prosecutor about the necessity of keeping some details confidential in order to protect the actual victims. Marcus, who for a while had stayed away from the drama, testified in a closed hearing about the photograph and the fear that had seeped into his life. His presence on the stand was like showing a scar, not to dramatize, but to bear witness. Dahlia's stance remained a complicated one. At first, she had pressured Amara toward discretion. Later, when the story's axis tilted toward exposure, Dahlia sought a kind of guarded reconciliation. She convened a private meeting in her office, where the curtains had the thickness of a vault, and told Amara that she had always hoped the family could have been repaired internally. "But the truth will have to take its course," she said, with a regret that had the weight of someone realizing the world was not the same as they had hoped. Amara listened, her thumb tracing the hem of her coat, as if reading the lines like a braille of conscience. "What you wanted, Dahlia, was preservation of an image. What I had to do was preservation of people."
Dahlia's eyes looked away for a moment, the armor falling back into place. "It was never only about image," she insisted. "It's about the ability to do good with resources that would otherwise be squandered by public scandal. But perhaps I misunderstood when I tried to measure what must be kept." "I don't think you misunderstood so much as you learned the cost in a different currency," Amara replied. "You valued continuity. I have to value safety." The conversation did not resolve everything. It could not. Culture and heart do not always reconcile in neat sentences, but it marked a turning point. Dahlia, for all her insistence on discretion, had a capacity to learn that was not purely stubbornness. She had a way of bending if the goods she believed in took on a different face. Kane's trial, prominent, methodical, and messy, dragged out into months. The legal aftermath involved hearings about regulation, privacy statutes, and corporate accountability. Evidence from Vanessa's USB played a crucial role, as did the mirrored server logs Margaret had secured in the Catskills. Amara testified in closed sessions, her words precise and measured. The world watched in fragments. Pundits, late-night commentators, a lot of people who had discovered the story through a headline and then moved on to other curiosities. But for the people whose lives had been recorded without consent, the process meant that someone in a position of influence had been held to account. There were retaliatory tactics, of course.
Kane's inner network tried to discredit witnesses. Anonymous posts surfaced that attempted to paint Amara as a mercenary, a staff member leveraging influence for pay. An attempt was made to hack the phones of the Whitmore staff. One night, the lights went dark across the estate, and the servers reverted to backup for an hour. Kane's reach was long, and the initial arrest did not sever every route. Victor did not escape unscathed either. When investigators began to parse the people physically present in the house, his name recurred in logs and in awkward testimonies. He was arrested quietly on a motion of accessories. His defense claimed that he was coerced by men with heavier accents and heavier wallets. The truth often sits between coercion and complicity. Victor's detention did little to answer why someone on site had been comfortable enough to wield a weapon, but it did serve as a form of justice for a person who had once carried a towel like armor. The public reckoning brought clauses of change, too. The Whitmore Foundation committed to structural reforms, oversight committees, transparent reporting of certain activities, and most importantly, a pledge to prioritize the dignity of people in their service. Margaret found herself being asked to consult on policy for other institutions. Daniel began to design a new security protocol that prioritized staff privacy above mere property. These were small regressions into decency, but they were meaningful.
They did not erase the past. They attempted to change the future. In the midst of the legal tumult, a quieter struggle unfolded at home. Marcus had returned to a schedule that was less precarious. He took up a steady job at a bookstore where the hours were honest and the owner trusted him. The photograph had catalyzed a change in him, as it had in Amara. He was more restless now, hardened slightly by the knowledge that their lives could be charted by strangers, but also calmer in a way that comes from being heard. Eli, who had been aware of none of the legal Perrys, remained a child who trusted Amara with crayons and the small domestic authority she had earned. Amara fixed his inconsistent shoelaces the morning after a late-night deposition, and he looked at her with the absolute regard of a person who accepts a single adult in his orbit as an island of safety. She kept a careful eye on him, and on the way his coloring books were arranged in the Whitmore house as if to anchor normalcy. The media cycle turned, as it always does, and some of the noise fell away. Yet the structural change remained. Kane faced multiple counts that were eventually negotiated into a plea that included restitution, public reporting of surveillance protocols, and an extensive oversight program for institutions that used the sort of technology Kane had commercialized. The settlements created frameworks that would take years to evaluate, but signaled to the industry that privacy could generate legal exposure if abused for profit. Amara's life changed in formal ways, too. There came a day when Charles asked to speak with her in his study, a room she had once entered only to polish the brass and rearrange the stationery. He offered her something that surprised her with its clarity, a title and a position that read both symbolic and practical, an executive role overseeing ethics and oversight for certain Whitmore operations. It was a job with a salary, yes, but it was also a seat at a table where decisions about people would be made. You have a perspective we lack. You have seen the house from places we cannot. I think it's only fitting you have a voice where we make choices. Amara looked at the paper. The title felt strange on the letterhead, and yet correct. She thought of her mother, who had taught her how to mend seams in silence, and of Marcus, who still called to remind her to eat. She thought of all the invisible hands and faces that had been the house's real wealth. It won't be easy, she thought, thinking of the pressure, the way Dahlia had framed culture as a shelter. She thought of the threat against Marcus and understood the long tail of consequences. It will be messy, but if there's a place to make decisions that protect people, I'll take it. Not for the title, because titles have a way of softening the edges of work, but because I want to make sure this doesn't happen to others. You won't be alone, Charles promised. There will be resources. We will fund the oversight, and we'll put processes in place.
We owe that." Dahlia's reaction to Amara's new role surprised her less by its shape than by its nuance. She hosted a small reception, ostensibly to celebrate a new initiative, but also to reframe the narrative around the house. There were speeches and toasts and a curated air of forward motion. Dahlia gave a speech that spoke to the family's duty to adaptation. When she pulled Amara aside afterward, their conversation was quiet and without the old strings of command. "I was wrong in the way I approached things," Dahlia said. "Not in every detail, perhaps, but in the assumption that a house must always be sealed to survive. You taught me that sometimes survival requires being seen. I didn't know how to reconcile that with the fear of losing what we'd built." Amara felt a warm, curving relief spread through her. The conversation did not erase the past, nor did it heal everything. It did something else. It shifted Dahlia from an implacable wall to a person capable of listening and adjusting. It was enough to show that culture, like the people who carried it, could change when its custodians were willing. The work that followed was less a parade and more a slow, stubborn turning of a mechanism. Amara established a small team composed of people who had been peripheral in a world that prized centrality. It included a woman from the catering staff who had an uncanny ability to inventory gaps, a former security tech who had been furloughed and who knew the language of feeds like a native tongue, and a young lawyer who had once interned for the foundation and now wanted to build frameworks so that dignity could be enforceable. Margaret consulted on technical audits. Daniel reworked protocols to ensure that staff areas were not swept for devices without due cause. There were arguments in meetings that sounded like new kinds of labor struggles, the kind where people insisted that dignity be put into policy and not just into decorative speeches. Not everyone welcomed these changes. There was resistance from parts of the board that worried about the optics of being criticized, and from some trustees who feared that admissions of wrongdoing would be exploited. But there was a momentum now that had a moral gravity to it, and that gravity turned conversations from passive defense into active reform. They also made space for restitution. Kane's plea involved funding for privacy education, support for victims, and a directive to de-link the use of domestic feeds from any revenue streams. The Whitmore Foundation allocated a fund for employees who had been exploited, discreet but meaningful. Amara oversaw the restitution panels with the awkwardness of someone who knew that money could not wholly repair a stolen life, but could ease the weight. There were other, smaller acts of attention. Amara checked Eli's homework and bought him pencils that did not break easily.
Marcus won a job that offered him a modest health plan and stability. He bought a small plant and placed it on his windowsill. Amara and Marcus had a conversation one night on their small balcony where they spoke about the future in terms of small domestic things, what they might cook for Mother's Day, how they'd finally fix the scuffed shoe shelf. The mundanity of such talk felt like a kind of sanctuary. But there were also scars that would not be entirely smoothed. Kane's influence had not been fully eradicated. There were companies that had changed their business model slightly, practice rings that would take years to regulate. Vanessa's cooperation cost her a life of plausible anonymity. She moved to another state under a witness protection program trimmed down for those who have turned state's evidence. Victor spent time in custody, and his fate was a reminder that the small cogs in larger machines sometimes doled out suffering without having the luxury of context to make it make sense. The final act of public moral reckoning came in an unexpected place, a congressional hearing on privacy and consent, where Margaret and Amara had been called as witnesses. Senators read from reports like from catechisms. The conversation about the ethical use of private data was suddenly national. Amara sat before microphones and a sea of cameras that reflected light like 1,000 tiny questions. She took the witness stand and did not play at rhetoric.
She told the truth as she experienced it, the way cameras rearranged relationships, the way dignity can be traded for revenue, and the cost it had extracted from families. At the end of her testimony, a woman in the audience, a program director from a nonprofit, thanked her in a voice that shook. "You gave people a language for what they'd experienced," the woman said. "You made privacy into something communal." When Amara returned home, the applause of strangers felt distant. Her true measure of change was quieter: a child who trusted her hand, a brother who had a job and stable hours, a house that had begun to ask itself who it served. She kept the scarf Dahlia had given her and occasionally smoothed it over her collar like a talisman for the months when her work felt like stepping into a wind that never stopped. There was one final confrontation that mattered more, perhaps, than any headline. Kane's sentencing day drew crowds of a certain type: lawyers in dark suits, families of victims whose faces had been visible in footage only because their lives were there to be recorded. Dahlia requested to see Amara privately before the public pronouncement. They stood in a small garden, the kind with a bench and a willow that kept time like an old clock. "You chose your heart," Dahlia said simply. "You chose a way that asked me to reevaluate the grammar I taught my children." Amara felt the same tension that had been there from the outset, but also the new possibility that a culture could be honed to protect rather than hide. "You forced me too," she said. "You forced me to reckon with consequences I had not anticipated. But in forcing me, you also made a claim on what we were protecting." Dahlia's hands were folded in front of her. "We were protecting an institution that we thought gave good. I feared that exposing it would cause others to suffer, but I am beginning to see that shelter built on secrecy is not shelter at all." The willow's leaves whispered against a breeze. The two women looked at each other like people who had survived a storm by learning to speak. The moment was fragile and real, and it was enough. The resolution that followed was not dramatic. Kane entered a plea and was sentenced to several years. Legal reforms were proposed and slowly took shape. The Whitmore Foundation restructured its oversight, and Amara's role as EVT of Ethics and Oversight evolved into something both formal and informal. People began to bring concerns to her who would never have thought to do so before. She listened. She helped build processes that made retaliation less likely and whistleblowing easier to support. She learned to create routes for the unseen to be seen without the glare. The work felt like learning a new language and teaching it to a family that had once prided itself on the old grammar. In the quiet aftermath, Amara walked the garden paths with Eli at her side, watching him toss pebbles into a small fountain. Marcus came by on Sundays, and they cooked a lentil stew the way their mother had taught them. On a bench under the willow, Amara kept the scar Dahlia had given her folded with a small card that said simply, "For courage and discretion." Sometimes courage requires the one who compels it to be confronted with its cost. Sometimes discretion must be redefined to protect rather than hide. On mornings when she passed the staff room, she paused to talk to people who had once been invisible to the very household she served. She listened to their stories and helped them navigate new policies that meant they could secure complaints without fear. The small things multiplied: a corrected payroll error, a safety net for temp workers, a new protocol that forbade the installation of feeds without multiple independent sign-offs. The reforms did not fix the underlying hunger for profit that feeds privacy abuse in other places, but they did create a precedent. Culture, she had learned, can be altered when its caretakers choose human dignity as a primary value instead of an afterthought. When she thought of Dahlia in the months after the scandal, she remembered a woman who had held on to an older grammar and then, through friction, softened. It was a small redemption. It was not absolution, because Dahlia had not orchestrated the abuses,
but she had presided over a house that had tolerated them through a culture of silence. The change in Dahlia was evidence that culture could be guided toward protection rather than preservation of prestige. At the end of the year, they held a quiet ceremony for the household staff, where Charles and Dahlia and Amara stood together. Charles said a few words about responsibility and the obligation to do better. Dahlia spoke about the necessity of preserving heritage while ensuring the dignity of those who live among it. Amara spoke with a voice that was not triumphant, but steady. "We were asked to choose between culture and heart," she said. "I learned that culture can be the home of the heart if we keep the people inside it safe and visible, not hidden." People clapped in a way that signaled more than gratitude. They signaled a recognition that the household had moved, however incrementally, toward a different ethic. Afterwards, in a small circle, Marcus came up behind Amara and put a hand on her shoulder. He was no longer the brother whose life could be shadowed by threats. He had work. He had a plant on his sill. He had, in a sense, been protected by the choice she made. That night, Amara walked alone to a small bench she had found in a public garden, a place where willow branches made private rooms of leaves. She folded the scarf into her hands and listened to the city's distant noise like a tide. The world had not become simple. Kane's network still had echoes elsewhere. There were reform bills that would take years to write and enforce. There was the knowledge that privacy is a battleground in the age of data, and that every victory tends to be partial. But there was also a child who trusted her, a brother who slept without looking over his shoulder, and a house that had begun to reconfigure what it meant to be a family that cared for its own. Culture, she had discovered, was not a single script. It could be reauthored by those who were courageous enough to insist that people matter more than image. She took out the photograph that had once been slipped under her door and folded it into a small pile of receipts she kept in a drawer. The photograph no longer felt like a threat. It was a map of the path that had led her here. She placed it in a box she had begun to build, a small archive of the work they had done, not for headlines, but for the people who had lived through it. She labeled it simply, "For the Invisible." There was no simple moral seal to affix to the story. There were losses and legal costs and reputations that would never look the same. There were people who had benefited from Kane's schemes, who would continue to push back. But there was also a measure of justice, a man accountable in court, policies altered, a foundation that learned to be its own critic, and a woman who had been made visible not by vanity but responsibility.
In the quiet before sleep, Amara thought of the way Dahlia had once told her that culture was a grammar for survival. She pressed the scarf to her chest and felt the texture of the fabric and of the moment. "I chose my heart," she whispered into the dark, and the words were not a triumph so much as a weathered truth. In choosing heart, she had not turned her back on culture, she had redefined it. Culture, she decided, should be a shelter for people, not a veil for power. She folded the scarf and placed it on the nightstand. The world outside the window went on. Inside the house she had once cleaned without being noticed, a child would wake and ask for breakfast, a brother would brew coffee, a woman who had once been invisible would take a seat at a table where the choices of many were debated. If you believed, in the end, that choosing the heart can change the grammar of a family or a foundation, share this story and subscribe for more narratives that listen for the invisible.